Welcome to this explainer. You know, when you picture a cyber attack, you probably imagine some dark room, glowing monitors, and a silent, invisible threat just creeping through a corporate network. Well, today, we're actually tearing down those Hollywood myths to look at the cold, calculated reality of cyber warfare. We are going to do a deep dive into the anatomy of a breach, specifically looking at the Windows Server attack chain. So, let's jump right in and see how these environments are actually compromised step by methodical step.
So, what really happens when an attacker targets a Windows server? Pop culture would have you believe it's a hacker furiously typing away, cracking firewalls in seconds with like a single magic command. But the reality? It's far more patient. Actually, they don't start by hacking the server at all. They start by learning. They methodically learn absolutely everything they can about the target before they ever even think about writing a single line of malicious code.
Now, real quick before we go any further, what we're breaking down today is an authorized cybersecurity demonstration. We're analyzing this playbook purely conceptually. This is definitely not a how-to guide for malicious acts, stealing credentials, or going after third-party infrastructure. We learn the offense here so we can build a much better defense. Make sense? Awesome.
Okay, so a successful breach is rarely just a single catastrophic event. It's a calculated sequence. The journey moves logically, starting with reconnaissance, going into enumeration, then exploitation, privilege escalation, and finally, lateral movement. Let's break down exactly how this chain is forged.
Phase 1, mapping the attack surface, or finding the cracks in the perimeter.
At this stage, the attacker is strictly on the outside, looking in. They use standard tools of the trade, stuff like Nmap for network reconnaissance and mass scan for large-scale discovery. Basically, they're sweeping for common exposed Windows services. They want to find web services, DNS, MSRPC, SMB, and of course, RDP. Every single open service represents another potential attack surface, just a tiny crack in the perimeter.
And once they know what's exposed, they start profiling the Windows environment. What domain is this server part of? What other machines are on this network? What services are running? And which accounts and shares might be hanging out in the open? Tools like NetExecutive and enum4linux-ng are used for this kind of enumeration. What's absolutely crucial to understand here is that right now, the attacker likely has zero administrative access. But hey, they don't need it yet. They are just quietly building a highly detailed map of the network.
Next up is vulnerability discovery. Attackers take that map and hunt for weaknesses. We're talking outdated software components, exposed network services, weak system configurations, or, known software vulnerabilities. They might spin up automated assessment tools like Nessus, OpenVOS, or Nuclei to find these gaps. But, and this is a big but, finding a vulnerability is literally just the beginning. A vulnerability doesn't automatically mean a compromise. The attacker still has to figure out a viable path from that vulnerability to actual usable access.
Phase 2. Breaching the perimeter and gaining a foothold.
This right here is where the narrative violently shifts. We go from passive outside scanning straight to active inside access. If a vulnerability is exploitable, the attacker is going to use a controlled validation framework, like Metasploit, to break in. This is the exact moment the dynamic completely changes. The attacker has officially crossed the threshold. They've got their foothold inside the environment.
Moving to Phase 3, escalating through Active Directory, the quest for credentials.
Once an attacker gets that initial foothold, credentials become literally everything. In a Windows environment, the crown jewel is Active Directory. It holds the keys to the kingdom. These environments rely heavily on Active Directory to manage authentication protocols, like NTLM and Kerberos, as well as permissions and privileged accounts across the entire domain. And because it controls so much, attackers turn to tools like Impacket, NetExec, and Mimikatz to abuse these credentials, manipulate authentication material, and exploit excessive privileges.
We've now reached one of the most dangerous parts of a Windows environment. The attacker isn't just looking for one massive vulnerability anymore. No, they are looking for a chain. Using analysis tools like Bloodhound or SharpHound, they map out a chain of relationships. They start off as just a standard user, maybe find a misconfiguration to become a local admin on a workstation, jump over to a server to compromise a privilege group, and ultimately achieve domain admin status. It's just a steady, calculated climb right up the privilege ladder.
So how exactly do they climb that ladder? Well, privilege escalation is where a very limited foothold becomes incredibly powerful. They meticulously examine file permissions, look for ways to abuse system services, exploit scheduled tasks, and review software configurations. Tools like WinPS and PowerUp are super common for this kind of privilege assessment research, letting the attacker turn a basic user account into powerful, sweeping administrative control.
And naturally, that leads to lateral movement. Basically, one compromised machine becomes the bridge to another. Once the attacker gets their hands on sufficiently privileged credentials, they don't just sit around on that first server. They pivot. They expand their reach rapidly from that initial server over to a file server, and eventually straight to the domain controller itself using remote administration protocols.
Phase 4, the defender's perspective. Let's flip the script. Okay, here's the part attackers really don't want you to see. All of that methodical, stealthy activity we just walked through, the reconnaissance, the enumeration, the lateral movement, it is virtually impossible to do completely silently. Every single action generates telemetry. It leaves a massive, highly visible trail. Let's look at the actual breadcrumbs. When an attacker moves, they light up Security Operations Center or SOC dashboards like a Christmas tree. Every single action drops a breadcrumb in the Windows Event Viewer, which tools like Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and Microsoft Sentinel are constantly picking up on. You've got Event 4625 for failed auths, followed by 4624 for a successful one. Event 4672 flags a privileged logon, 4688 catches a suspicious process, and 4720 or 4732 trigger whenever users or groups are changed. The telemetry is always there. But here's the rub. An isolated event, like just a single failed login, looks completely harmless on its own, right? But a good security operation doesn't investigate events individually. Using a SIEM, a security information and event management tool, like Microsoft Sentinel, defenders correlate these events. So, failed auth plus privileged logon plus suspicious process plus lateral movement. Suddenly, those isolated events are strung together into a highly actionable, screaming security incident alert.
Phase 5, breaking the attack chain and how to actually protect the network.
When an incident does happen, the response isn't simply to just pull the plug and kick the attacker out. Honestly, that's just a temporary fix. Proper incident response is a strict process. First, you contain the compromised endpoint. Second, you investigate. You absolutely need to understand exactly how they got in and what they touched. Third, you remediate by resetting credentials and patching that initial vulnerability. And fourth, you validate that the attacker cannot simply return through some hidden backdoor they left behind.
Now, to break the attacker's momentum before an incident even occurs, you need a core defensive arsenal. Windows Server security isn't about one single magic software product. It means strict patching of vulnerabilities, mandated multi-factor authentication, network segmentation so that one compromised machine doesn't just bridge to the entire network, and enforcing the principle of least privilege, meaning giving users only the access they absolutely need. And finally, you absolutely must have EDR and SIEM monitoring to watch the whole shebang continuously.
As we pull all these concepts together, the ultimate lesson is really this. The emphasis has to be on structural security rather than just marveling at operational exploitation. The real question isn't only, can an attacker get in? Because, well, given enough time, they usually can. The much more important question is, how far can they go once they do get in? By actively reducing the attack surface, protecting identities, and monitoring continuously, defenders can stop that lateral movement dead in its tracks.
Which leaves us with this final lingering thought. We've seen the reconnaissance. We've traced the exploitation, the privilege escalation, and the lateral movement. We know the tools, and we know the exact telemetry they leave behind. Knowing all of that, and looking closely at the defensive posture of your own infrastructure, could your Windows environment survive this attack chain? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.